Well, the recording's going, so time to move along. So we are in chapter 6 of Eduyot. We are more than halfway through. We're about 3/4 of the way through. So we're on chapter 6 for our new student. You'll find that at the top of the page. It'll say Eduyot, and then it'll have a number, colon, and then another number. You want that first number to say 6, and the second number to say 1. We're on chapter 6, Mishnah 1. And for those of you who have been following along through all of our discussions so far, we are now going back to the earliest style. That is to say, we had a huge long detour about Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. Now, and a few digressions, but now we are going back to the original style, which is Rabbi so-and-so, this is what he taught. And we also share whether anyone disagrees with him. So that's the format we're moving back to. This is a good place for me to sort of remind or point out, if you're new, that one of the things that makes Eduyot special, apart from the fact that it pulls topics from across Jewish law, is that it's very similar in some ways to Pirkei Avot. Pirkei Avot, the ethics of our fathers, as usually translated, is one of the most famous and favorite sections of the Mishnah because it has many of the wisdom statements of the sages. Eduyot is sort of the other side of that same coin, but rather than collecting their wisdom statements in like general life advice, it instead collects all of their particular legal statements. Showing that those as well are meant to be preserved. I know that it's catchier to post on Facebook or Instagram some witty little thing, but halakha is the bread and butter for how we live, not just the feel-good sentences. So it's nice that we have in the Mishnah both versions, even if Pirkei Avot gets a lot more screen time.
Rabbi, since it doesn't have a dissenting opinion in 6.1, is that considered the ruling of the Mishnah?
You cannot rely on that. So Eduyot, as we talked about way at the very beginning, will include minority opinions that are rejected by the majority. So where it matters or where it deviates from the majority, I'll try and point that out. But Eduyot does collect all of the opinions, well, not all, but most of the opinions, whether they end up being the final legal ruling or not.
But if it's just Hillel, then it's, unless there's something that says otherwise, then it's accepted.
There is a complicated rubric for how you know which rabbi wins, but usually that only applies once you've gone through the Talmud to see how it plays out in detail. We don't try and deduce who wins just by the Mishnah itself. But yes, there is a whole pattern of Rabbi so-and-so versus Rabbi so-and-so. First rabbi usually wins. These people versus these people, usually these people win. A single versus a minority, or a majority, usually this, but except in these cases. So there's a whole long, complicated list of, well, everybody's here, of how it all works out. So that makes sense?
Yes.
Okay. Then let's get down to work. Are we short a copy?
Yeah, I need a copy.
Because 1, 2, 3, 4. I thought I had 5 copies. Hold on a second. Did I tidy it up by accident? Oh, yep, there it is. I thought there was 5, that there were 5 printouts.
Does everyone got one? I use my phone.
No, it looks like everybody who doesn't have their own copy has this copy, so we're good. Natan, could you pull the door shut so the AC builds up a little? I'm getting hot. I'm getting hot flashes.
Okay.
All right, so now that we had that introduction to the introduction, as the old saying goes, before I begin, I'd like to say a few words. We are now on chapter 6, Mishnah 1, and again, we don't have our designated reader, which means we will go around the room. Does anybody want to volunteer to start so I don't keep picking on poor Richard each time? Or does everybody want me to keep picking on Richard?
No.
We don't let the lawyer talk first.
Okay, we'll move.
The lawyer.
There we go. We'll rotate who we pick from as well.
So, Rabbi Judah ben Bava testified concerning 5 things. 1, that women who are minors are made to declare an annulment of their marriage.
Okay, pause. So each one of these is totally different topics, so we're just going to take them bite-sized at a time. All right, so what are we talking about here? Well, I'm trying to remember how much we've covered about Jewish marriage. So let's go back to the basics of a Jewish marriage. What is the first thing that creates a marriage bond in Judaism? The betrothal, right? So what is the main symbol of that nowadays?
Ring.
Right, the ring, right? So when there's a declaration made that there is going to be a marriage, you do the ring. Now nowadays, that ceremony, along with the bracha and the glass of wine, that's done about 10 minutes before the end of the marriage process, which is the Sheva Brachot, the 7 blessings. In the old days, you would often do the betrothal when kids were still before age. They were under bar and bat mitzvah age, right? Now, the kids didn't do it, the parents did it. So 2 fathers would get together and say, hey, your son, my daughter, why don't we get them together? And they would say, it's a good idea. And then they would make a betrothal on behalf of the kids, right, on the minors. When they are old enough, however, they are able to refuse, right? So they're able to say, no, we're done. We're not going any further, right? We're finished. This is not going to go on to 7 blessings. The kids do have the right to choose for themselves. It's one part where the whole Fiddler on the Roof first daughter thing was a bit mistaken. Hello. Okay, we are going to have to share printouts. This is great. That's not this week's.
No.
Nope. Well, that's from the parasha, but it's not. But that's not the Mishnah.
Oh.
But it's a fascinating collection of commentary for the parasha, if I do say so myself.
Okay.
You mean this was from?
That was from today's Lunch and Learn, yeah. I always felt Lunch and Learn, but no one actually lunches.
How many years they have in order to break it, the relationship with the kids?
When they turn 13, when they reach.
So at 13, okay. So at 13 they can decide. But what happens if they don't decide at 13? They decide at 16 or 15?
Then they're going to get married usually. But they can always get a divorce afterwards, right?
Yeah, but what happens if they don't want? They change their mind before the marriage.
So they can change their mind before they get married, right? Before they get to the Sheva Brachot, yes, they can change their mind. But
so it's at 13.
13 is when they can begin to use their right to refuse the match that was made on their behalf.
And can anyone take initiative, man or female? Or
But they, vice versa, both have to agree to it when they are of age, right? It's not a question of initiative. You can't force a woman, for example, to get married. If you drag her to the chuppah and say, all right, stand here while we say the 7 blessings, and she's like, no, then that's not a wedding, right? That's called a kidnapping. So both have to agree and go along with the process.
Yep.
Go ahead.
It worked with Leah, though. She was forced, right?
Depends on exactly how you read that particular part of this Torah, right? In the story in the Torah, it's unclear whether Leah was a willing participant or an unwilling participant. It's also unclear exactly how much Jacob knew or didn't know about what was going on. That's why there are many midrashim written about the narrative section of that particular thing. But what we definitely know is that the behavior of Lavan and how he manipulated his daughters and his future son-in-law is not the pattern we follow. And so even if that was accepted as what happened then, that doesn't mean we imitate it. So we don't learn our halacha from Lavan's behavior. But the question here is not about whether you can reject or not reject. That everybody agrees you can reject the match once you reach age of majority. The question is, if the girl is still a minor, she cannot reject it. But there are certain circumstances, namely having to do with possible Levirate marriage combinations, where we might want her to reject it because we don't want to wait until she's old enough to do the rejection more formally.
But both need to be the same age?
No.
What happens if one is 15 and the other one is 12?
Right?
So it's a big gap.
Well, when 12, a girl would already be allowed, right? So, because
okay.
she comes
11,
in.
let's say 11, okay,
right?
And he's 15,
right?
So it's
going on 16.
Yeah, but it's a little odd because a lot of pressure in the situation.
Of course. Okay, so.
But like, there's any.
Hold on. So the
rules.
If we want to talk about sociology, about the culture, yes, this was very complicated, and there were many different issues that could encourage the community to approve or disapprove of different types of matches, and to encourage or discourage the young people to go along with their parents' wishes. So, like I said, legally, the whole first scene in Fiddler on the Roof with the first daughter, where they're trying to force her to marry Laser Wolf, and she's like, I don't want to marry him. And he's like, I'm the papa, you'll marry who I tell you to marry, blah, 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 right? Well, technically, he doesn't have the right to force her, especially because she's of age, right? She's definitely over the age of 12 or 13. But that doesn't mean that he and the rest of the community can't lean on her to go along with it, can't embarrass, shame, guilt, whatever you want to describe it, or just simply say, fine, if you don't want to marry who I picked for you, get out of my house. Right? That's legal. It may not seem nice to us, but that was an accepted practice in classical communities, not only Jewish, but most other places around the world, where marriage, yes, always had an element of romance and always had an element of affection, but also had an element of survival. And therefore, it was usually considered too important to let young people just pick for themselves who they wanted to marry, because that was a really good way to end up starving to death. So yes, the family and the community could often pressure them to go along with a match that the young person may not have personally had the most great passion for the other person. But the community might have said, yeah, but everyone thinks you should. And yeah, people would.
How can you decide who is the better match for your daughter or your son as a minor if you don't know the character of the person?
I think that's irrelevant. They were looking for arrangements as far as how families would go together and how it would compensate this person and that person. In my mind, that's what they were looking for. They weren't looking for whether they were a good match. They were looking for whether it was good for the community or good for the individual.
But you don't know if the other partner will be a bad person. Because that would be a good family.
Hold on, wait. So Natan, how do you know whether he's going to be a good person? Yes. What is his family background?
You know
what is his family? What is his background? Does he come from a good family? Does he come from a not so good family?
Yeah, right? Bad apples or something with their families.
Oh yes, I know. But people didn't have the luxury of waiting until they were 25 years old to see what the person was like, and therefore they used other criteria. This was not Match.com, where they were worried about the personal compatibility of the two people. People were expected to make it work, and if it was a truly bad match, if one of the spouses was abusive or unfaithful, then that's why we have divorce, right? There are ways to fix that on the other side of those major problems, and minor problems you were supposed to fix yourself. You were supposed to live with, right? If your husband is not always talking to you as much as you want, if your wife is not always listening to your problems as much as you want, you try to make that work. You talk to your parents to get advice, or your grandparents. You talk to your friends about how to make this work. Maybe you even talk to your rabbi, and you try to find a way to make it work. And only if it's just not going to work at all, then yes, you would go through the difficulty of divorce. But that was not the first option. The first option was to try to make it work, because there were so many other considerations other than just personal compatibility. The idea that your spouse would also be like your best friend, that is late 20th century. That isn't even early 20th century. That's a very, very modern conception from really my generation and slightly older. Prior to that, you were expected to have your friends at work. You were expected to have your friends in your other social activities, your bowling club, the Lions Club, the sewing circle, friends of the library, wherever else you were hanging out. That was where you were expected to have your friends, and your spouse was a partner. And yes, you loved them and were devoted to them and looked after them, and they looked after you and all of that, but they weren't your buddy. Just like your kids weren't your buddies. That's also a very, very late 20th century thing. That's still
first century.
I was going to say, which still bugs. Which still bugs me. Well, no, because a lot of the parents were born in late 20th century, who are now raising children in the 21st and treating their children like they're supposed to be friends, rather than actually being parents to their children.
That's a big problem.
It's a huge problem. But that's mostly because people have become isolated from real friends and have far fewer friends than they used to, because we have less social interactions than we used to.
Mhm.
And partly that is our own choice because we have chosen to only have perfect social interactions. So we retreat to our Netflix, we retreat to our phones, we retreat to our own little homes, rather than having to share those experiences with other people and put up with them and learn to be friends with people who aren't perfect for us. That's a major issue long-term for Western society. But in this Mishnah, still on the first sentence, the question, that's how study is supposed to go. The question is, what if we need her to cancel and to reject the marriage while she is still a minor? Because of, like I
What's a
said,
minor? What age do they consider a minor?
pre-bar and bat mitzvah.
Pre-bar and bat mitzvah.
Exactly.
But they're saying annulment. Annulment means they're already married.
Well, that's because the betrothal counts as like a marriage. It's all the responsibilities of marriage with none of the perks. And so you would need to annul that betrothal because you were kind of, sort of, technically married to that person, kind of. Engagement in the biblical and ancient and classical system was much stronger than our version of engagement. A famous example: if somebody is engaged but not married under Judaism, and she sleeps with somebody that's not her fiance, that's called adultery under Jewish law. That's not just breaking your engagement. That's adultery with all that it implies under Jewish law. Whereas in under modern culture, that's just called, it happens. It's not considered adultery, it's just considered being unfaithful. So the bond was much stronger, therefore it needed an annulment in order for it to happen. And like I said, in certain cases, you might want her to undo a particular marriage in order to allow a levirate marriage or other betrothals that were more automatic to come into force.
My logic on your question is,
Which one?
your original question.
Oh, okay.
Okay, if that the parents have the right to find and match to the kids when they are minors, so if they are still minors, they have also the parents the right to
Annul.
and do
Right.
the deal. So maybe that's the answer to your question. The parents can do it because they are still minors, so they can also have the same right. If they do, also to undo.
Right, but the Mishnah is telling us that she has that right. That we can tell her, in this case, we need you to annul, right? And she can then perform that duty herself. We don't have to worry about her waiting till she's reached the age of maturity. So let me give you an example, right? So a daughter has been betrothed to Mr. Smith, right, or Mr. Cohen or whoever, and it becomes imperative because of levirate reasons. You can read, there's a great example in the printout, but it's way too long to go into. We've done enough of those before. It becomes imperative for her to annul that, but her dad and her mom are dead. There's no parent around to annul this. So can she, or do we have to wait for her to reach age, maturity, before she can annul? And the Mishnah is saying, yes, she can. That we, as the rabbis, can tell her, normally, we would tell you, wait until you're of mature age, and then you can annul what your parents arranged for you. But in this case, we want you, in fact, we're going to kind of almost force you to do this annulment in order that we can untangle this particular problem.
I was going to say, how much, in Judaism, I take it there's a thing called coercion or duress when entering into contract.
It's called onus, yeah.
Yeah, how much does that apply to these marriages?
A lot and a little. So officially, you can't force anyone to marry anyone.
But what's forced becomes a question.
Exactly, right? So if I tell you, marry her, right? And if you don't marry her, I will shoot you. Everyone agrees that under those circumstances, that marriage is not considered a valid marriage.
Right.
However, if I say, marry her or you can't live in my house. Okay, is that duress? Well, it's certainly putting pressure on me.
Right.
But I still have a perfectly valid choice. No one is threatening me with physical harm. No one is threatening me with death. They're threatening with challenge, that it's going to be much harder for me to go out on my own, to cut me off from my inheritance or whatever it might be. But I still ultimately make that decision. And this becomes also very important at the other end of marriage, that is to say divorce, of whether someone is being coerced into giving a get or not. And that is also especially relevant because the rabbis often feel the need to coerce a husband into giving a get, since the wife can't initiate under classical law.
So if they kick you out of the house after you get married, I mean, it's like, well, you might as well get divorced now because you're.
Yeah, I mean, but of course you can get divorced if you can pay the ketubah, right? If you can pay the settlement.
You know, I have a problem with the concept here. Okay?
You know, betrothing before someone.
No. About the
That's okay.
giving the right of a minor to decide this. Okay?
Only in special circumstances.
Yeah, I know.
Right.
Because I see from a different perspective. Okay, everything that we learn until now, all the Mishnah that we learn until now. Okay, all of them, the minor they didn't have any haibut, any obligation, not for the sukkah, sukkah, not for tefillah, not for reading the Torah, that for nothing. And suddenly, someone that doesn't have any obligation at all in every aspect of life, suddenly, oh yes, you can have the right now if you want to undo the marriage. Is that going from coming from no place?
Right, but it's not a blanket. It's not a blanket permission, right? This idea of giving the right for the annulment under these circumstances is for a specific set of circumstances. It's not saying that 8-year-old can just decide she doesn't want it. It's saying if the rabbis of the town say, look, in this particular situation, because of everything that's happened, we need you to annul this, she is allowed to under those circumstances only. It's not just she wakes up one day and decides to reject what her parents have arranged. Because yeah, you're right, then we're dealing with a fickle child, and that doesn't work out so well. So, all right, let's see if we can get sentence 2.
That a woman is allowed to remarry on the evidence of one witness.
Okay, remember what I said about divorce and how that can also be tricky? Well, there's also the case of the death of the husband where there isn't enough evidence that would normally prove that he died, right? So let's say you and your husband are on a voyage and he gets washed over the railing one day and you see him get eaten by a shark. Okay, you, the wife, saw your husband get eaten by a shark. There's no one else on deck who saw him get eaten by the shark. Are you a widow or are you not? Right now, classically under Jewish law, if I want to prove that someone murdered someone, I need 2 witnesses that can prove that person murdered. Plus, classically under Jewish law, I need 2 male witnesses. Right? Women were not allowed to, or their testimony was not accepted under most circumstances, which had to do also because of coercion and serving someone else in the household, which meant that their testimony was always considered likely to be influenced by the other members of the household, and therefore couldn't be relied. So what do? Do I just tell her, we don't believe you. You think your husband is still alive, and that means you are still married, and if you remarry, it's called adultery? Or do we say, sure, yeah, shark, no problem. You're a widow, and here's your ketubah, and go get remarried if you want. The Mishnah tells us, in this particular case, we accept her testimony.
Her testimony.
Her
one testimony.
Her testimony.
So she can testify for herself.
Yep. Right. Right.
Because here the translation is one married the woman based on the testimony of a single witness, but didn't say anything else.
So she's a single witness.
No, but it said that by the self.
It says one witness, not her.
Sorry, you're right.
Exactly.
Sorry, I was talking about another case about that, but this is talking about, you're right, a single witness. And sorry, let me change my example.
Okay.
Right, it wasn't her and her husband, it was him and his business partner. And his business partner says he got eaten by a shark. Are we willing to accept his testimony? And in this particular case, yes, we do. Do we accept his testimony that he changed the contract of their partnership? No. Do we accept his testimony that he changed his inheritance, ideas? No. But do we accept that he's dead? Yes, we are willing to accept that in order that she can remarry.
But if she's not dead and she remarries, we're in trouble, right?
Well, yes and no. So this fits into a classic conundrum of what we mean when we say it's law or not, right? So if you say that it's legal for her to get married, then does that describe reality or does that create reality? Right? If we are describing her as free to remarry, are we saying that is what the world is, or are we saying we are changing the world to declare it to be this way? And a lot of people, especially in the modern world, after logical positivism made such a big influence in the early 20th century, we want to describe the world. We think we're doing science when we're doing law, right? When I say guilty, I have found guilty particles on him. And that means I can tell you he is guilty. And if I say he is not guilty, it's because those guilty particles were missing. And if I say this is, a copyright violation, it is because I found copyright violation particles. And that means I've identified them, and now I know that it's true. As I've said many, many times, there's no answer key for legal decisions. There is no objective measure for this is what the law says, this isn't what the law says. Instead, once you declare it's a copyright violation, this is guilty or whatever, that is the status of that thing. And therefore, if the rabbis say she is now a widow, she is now a widow.
Wouldn't she be able to get a divorce after like a month at most or 2 months based on the fact that the husband hasn't fulfilled his obligation?
She could get a divorce, but from who?
The rabbinic court, the Beit Din.
They can't give her a divorce on behalf of him. They can lean on him to give a divorce. But if he's dead or absent, they can't really lean on him. Now, there are other methodologies that are available, but they are what we like to call the nuclear option. Right? There is a way for rabbinic courts to annul retroactively the original marriage. It's called Hafka'at Kiddushin. And this is, in fact, in the modern world, what the conservative movement will do if we have a husband who refuses to cooperate with giving a get for a divorce, because we no longer have the leverage to convince reluctant husbands to allow their women, their wives to be divorced under Jewish law, even if they're divorced now under secular law. And so we sometimes have to resort to a nuclear option, which says, look, you got married, Kedat Moshe Yisrael, you got married according to the laws of Moses and Israel. And therefore, if Israel says you're not married anymore, you're not married anymore. And the rabbis have the authority to do that.
But yeah, I thought the husband had certain obligations to the wife
He does.
involving, and if he doesn't follow, if he fails to meet those obligations, I thought she could petition the court for a divorce.
She can. He still has to do the paperwork.
Really?
Yep.
The rabbi can't.
No, well, he has to authorize the paperwork. He has to say, write a get to give to my wife. If he cannot give those instructions because he's dead or absent, then the divorce can't happen.
So this law is in order to prevent agunot?
Exactly. Or at least not prevent, but at least minimize the amount, because it could very easily happen. There was a battle and my husband and some other guy, they were rushing in, and only the other guy came back, and he said that my husband was killed by the enemy. No one else saw my husband fall because there was a battle. I mean, who was keeping score? And we didn't get to go back and find the bodies, so now he's just missing in action. But his buddy says he was dead.
I thought I saw this on a JLI thing about crimes and consequences, where a person was basically convicted off of a false confession.
Right.
Based on that confession, the rabbis allowed her to get remarried, and it turns out the guy wasn't dead.
Quite probably, yeah. So, and that's why you get lots of books written during the Middle Ages about issues of, Shlomo going to Italy and leaving behind a wife in Algeria, but they cooked up something where she would be, set free because, some other guy would say that he saw him die. There were all sorts of schemes. The fact that people lie and cheat is not new. That's not 20th century. That's called human history.
So that runs into the problems of adultery and all that.
Then you have to untangle whether or not everything was made, what we say, b'ta'ut, in error, and then that can unravel everything. But assuming that it was not made in error, it is considered to be correct.
By error, you mean it was not made in that he actually died, or that
it was
good faith?
A deliberate deception. Yeah, a good faith issue.
Fraud, basically.
That's the usual benchmark. Yes, but it gets complicated. Yeah, that's when you get down into the nitty gritty. All right. Line 3. This one's going to be fun. Probably not as controversial, though.
That a rooster was stoned in Jerusalem because it had killed a human being.
Okay. Exodus 21. If you get an ox that gores somebody, the ox will be executed for what it's doing, right? Is that only for ox? What happens if it's a dog? What happens if it is a lion?
We spoke about that. If a dog attack you in your backyard, it's your responsibility because you're the owner of the dog.
What about a chicken?
It's the same. Attack is attack.
So, well, that's the question. The question is, even if it is such an impossible and improbable assault that a person would be killed by a chicken, we still treat the chicken like we would an ox. You don't say, well, it probably wasn't the chicken. Maybe the guy, just had a weak heart, or maybe he was going to die anyway, or what. No, if the chicken is the actual cause of death, then we treat the chicken like we would treat a bear or any other animal that is causing this kind of deadly attack. And therefore, the animal is put down the same way we would put down a more ferocious and threatening type of animal. And he says that's the way it works. Yeah.
Kehati says it's a chicken or rooster that
with a child.
Child.
So one of the commentary, the Kehati and others, say, how could this actually be a possibility? Because everyone has a hard time believing that a chicken could kill a person. And so the explanation that is given is that it was a chicken killing a child or an infant, which is a little bit more believable. Especially, I don't know if you've ever been around roosters.
They're very aggressive.
Yeah, they're mean, and if they've got good spurs, they can cause considerable damage. It wouldn't be lethal to any adult, but yes, it is plausible that it could kill a child.
Yeah, normally one keeps only one rooster in an area.
Yeah, for exactly that reason, because they'll do considerable damage to each other. All right, line 4. Totally new topic.
And about wine 40 days old, that it was used as a libation on the altar.
All right, so libation is the fancy word for liquid sacrifice. It's any sacrifice that is done in liquid form is a libation. At least that's how the English works. And the question here is, okay, we know that we used wine for sacrifices, but what counts as wine, right? If I go and I get some grapes and I squeeze them into a cup, is that wine? Right? It is pre-hagafen. It is the fruit of the vine. Does that count? Well, it does count for some things. For example, you can use grape juice for kiddush and for other ritual purposes. Can you use it for a sacrifice? And the answer was 40 days old. Right? It's got to be at least 40 days old wine, not fresh grape juice.
Generation size.
It's not that. It's just a question of it's old enough to be called wine. They had to find a measure that was after 40 days. We'll call that wine, and before 40 days, we'll just call that juice. And 40 days was what they settled on. Right? They didn't have ways of testing like proof, for the alcohol content or things like that. They just went off the age of the wine as being the measure.
They didn't have anything to do with like Noah, that 40 days doesn't come anywhere biblical, does it?
Nope.
Just randomly?
No, not randomly. 40 days is considered a round number biblically, right? So I guess you could say it had something to do with Noah in the sense that for the same reason that Noah had 40 days, for the same reason that Moses had 40 days, for the same reason that we were 40 years in the wilderness, 40 is a round number. I know it doesn't feel like a round number to us, but that's because we're different.
Kehati says that it has to be causing you to be drunk.
It has to be capable. It has to be capable, right? It has to have begun the fermentation process.
Yeah.
But what
That's
causes?
like 40 days.
But what causes you to be drunk and what causes me to be drunk, and how much we have to drink is very different. So 40 days was the benchmark because there would at least be some fermentation happening. So now it was theoretically possible that this could cause someone to be drunk. Maybe. Okay, and number 5.
And about the morning Tamid offering, that is offered at the 4th hour.
Okay, so in order to make sure we know when we're supposed to do the right, when did we do the sacrifices at the time? The point here is that this is be offered at the 4th hour of the morning. Remember, these are relative hours. The hours were not set up with 60 minutes each of the same number of seconds and 24 hours in the day. The hours were 12 days of however much daylight we've got. So if the day is exactly 12 hours long of daylight, each hour is exactly an hour long. If the day is 6 hours of daylight, each hour would be 30 minutes long. So you measure from sunset or sunrise to sunset for your days of, or for your hours of the day. Anybody who was here, I think, Tom, were you here on the first day of school when I had the rabbinic sundial and showed the kids?
Yes.
Yeah, it's actually really easy to have a rabbinic sundial. You just take a bowl, cut it in half again, so you have like a quarter of the scoop, put a stick out of it, and you just mark equidistant lines on it into 12 sections, and you just stand out and catch the shadow. And that is, it's a relative sundial. It's worthless if you want to know what o'clock it is, but it's great if you want to know rabbinic time.
So the fourth hour would be the fourth hour after sunrise.
Exactly, whichever hour that might be. Right. So in the summer, that's going to be later. In the summer, it will be a longer hour, but probably earlier because the sun rose earlier. And in the winter, it will be sooner after the sun rose, but probably later because the sun rises late. No daylight savings back then. Make sense? Okay. Now we get to the more complicated ones. So we get 6.2 and 6.3, which are going to both cover similar topics. So we're going to start off with 6.2 and we'll see how far we get. We're definitely not finishing 6.3 tonight. I can guarantee that, because it's the longest Mishnah in the entire book. I mean, the entire book of Eduyot. So we normally go around. So that means if you would like to read next, you're welcome to. If you would like to pass, you just say pass.
Sure, I'll read. You want me to start with number 1?
Number 1. Yeah, Mishnah 2, number 1.
Rabbi Joshua and Rabbi Nehunia ben Elinathan, a man of
Kafar Hababli. You're regretting you're regretting your choice to read.
Yeah, Kafar Hababli testified concerning a limb separated from a corpse that it is impure.
Okay, so here's the question, and sometimes a diagram helps. We'll see it in this case. I've got a dead guy. We all know that a dead guy is impure, right? First degree level of ritual impurity, that is tameh, absolutely. Ritually impure in the most ritually impure sense. That's a dead person.
No, but doesn't somewhere say that that's not necessarily true in this Mishnah?
Dead people are always ritually impure. Wait till we get through all of it before we start taking this apart. Amputation, apart, see? If I take him apart, if I cut off his leg, right? Is the cut off part still impure, or is only the corpse impure? That's the question that they're arguing about. Okay, does everyone understand the basic principle? All right, so our two heroes, right, Rabbi Joshua and Rabbi Nehunia, they are saying that limb, yes, it is impure, right? If it was taken from a corpse, the limb is impure. Everyone with us so far? Okay, part 2.
Whereas Rabbi Eliezer says they declared this only of a limb from a living man.
Okay, so Rabbi Eliezer says no. Sorry, switching back and forth between Hebrew and English. He's still alive, right? And he's happy. Not being next to a mutilated corpse, but he's happy because he's still alive. If he's ritually pure, well, imagine there's a barrier between them. And now he's unhappy because someone cuts off his leg. Is his leg ritually impure or pure? Right? What status does his leg have? Well, Rabbi Eliezer says, and the sages agree, that the leg is indeed ritually impure. Right?
Is that something dead?
It's now a dead limb.
Yeah.
So the question then is, what about the dead leg of a dead person? And what Rabbi Eliezer is saying is the idea that this leg of the living person, that the leg of the living person is impure only applies to the living person. And it doesn't tell you anything about the dead person's leg. Okay, I love your squinting.
No, because it came from a body that is impure, so one part of something impure is still impure.
Maybe.
How not?
Well,
We can
that's
still say these are two different cases and talk about this one in one sentence and the other one in a separate sentence.
right, because you're lucky that they're going to argue about it. So we're going to see their justification for the position. So if you could read part 3, this is Rabbi Joshua and Rabbi Nehunya arguing back with Rabbi Eliezer.
They said to him, "Is not there an inference from the minor to the major?
Which is what we call a kal v'chomer argument.
If in the case of a living man who is himself pure, a limb severed from him is impure, how much more so in the case of a corpse which is itself impure, should a limb severed from it be impure?"
Welcome to Natan, right? So Natan, this was your argument, which is if a limb taken off of a pure person becomes impure by virtue of amputation, then certainly a limb taken off an impure dead body should remain impure as it was part of the impure body prior to the amputation, right? How does it suddenly not get impure once it's been amputated? That's their position. Seems very logical. Rabbi Eliezer has the ultimate retort.
He said to them, "They have nevertheless declared it only of a limb from a living man."
All right, compare number 4 to number 2. That line with our first Rabbi Eliezer line. What do you notice? Apart from the bracket part, ignore that for the moment.
Talks about what they said and what he heard.
Exactly. It's the same. It's the same position. So they give a logical explanation of why this and this should be, linked. And you can understand from this that this has to also be true. And he's like, but I only heard about this. What he is saying is, I can't apply logic. What I can do is repeat the teachings I was given. Rabbi Eliezer was famous for being someone who only repeated the teachings he had been taught. Right? He was an encyclopedia of knowledge, but he could just repeat the knowledge. And that's not a bad thing. I know in America we love creative thinkers and all of that stuff. But someone who can remember an encyclopedia's worth of statements of Jewish law, that was absolutely a treasure for most of Jewish history. And being creative was also a bonus, but he was someone who would be very strict with himself of saying, I only heard this case. I didn't hear this case. So if you want to ask me about this case, I can tell you this one, but I can't tell you that. So your inference, I can't agree with it because that's not what I learned. Not I learned you were wrong, but I didn't learn that inference. And in a sense, it's so abstention is more to say, I'm not sure. But what she's saying is you're not allowed to make that inference. Right? If you have another tradition of why the leg is impure, that's fine. But if your only reason for thinking the leg is impure is because with the leg of a living person it's impure, then you are drawing you are drawing the conclusion from inadequate evidence.
Yeah, but what happened, for example, if you have a terrorist attack where some explode and you have part of bodies in every place.
Right.
Still, everything is dead. It's dead material, so everything is impure.
But if I haven't
concentrated in one place, sadly.
But if I haven't been told it's impure, then how can I believe it is impure? Remember what we were saying before about, there's no guilty particles. There's no impurity particles. So I can't take a magnifying glass and go, oh yeah, that's impure. I need to know what the judgment is meant to be based upon our received tradition, right? The oral law. And if I don't have that justification because I was not taught that a limb from a dead body was impure, even if this sounds logical, I can't make that leap. Now, we might think, but come on, right? But making those leaps is one of the ways we can get into trouble. right? Because logic can do almost anything, right? And I mean, you can use logic to prove things that are maybe not true. In fact, this was the problem with Rabbi Meir. I believe you asked earlier before about how do we know which of the rabbis like wins out over the others in competition. Well, Rabbi Meir is famous for any Mishnah that is said in his name, we don't follow because he was too clever. And no one could follow his logic, and therefore it made it sound like things that were pure were impure and things that were impure were pure. Because he could come up with an explanation and a case for anything, but that didn't mean he was right.
That's just bad logic.
No, it wasn't bad logic.
He was a really, really good debater.
Exactly. And it meant that he could interpret things to make it sound reasonable. But if you didn't have a sound tradition to check it against, how did you know it really was correct? Right? Jewish law is not just about coming to a reasonable conclusion.
It has to be a precedent.
Exactly. It has to be a reasonable conclusion that is grounded somewhere in the tradition, and the tradition, of course, grounded in Torah and in Jewish law. There needs to be that chain, that precedent. You can't just come up with a good argument. It has to have a pedigree. It has to have something behind it to give it legs. To give it standing for it. And that's what Rabbi Eliezer was very strong about. He said, if I have a tradition, then I know what to rule and I will follow it. But I'm not going to make your leap of logic just because it sounds plausible. We talked a little bit about it that's in Lunch and Learn, but you can find many more examples in the tradition where Kal v'chomer, this all the more so from the minor to the major arguments, are very slippery. And it's easy to get it the wrong direction. And in fact, the Talmud spends a lot of time of saying your Kal v'chomer is not a valid Kal v'chomer. So just because it's said once doesn't mean it is good enough.
But then how does he make rulings on stuff where there's no precedent?
So if he has enough of a tradition to go off of, then he can use that. If he doesn't, then why do you believe he needs to make a ruling that says something is impure?
Because you gotta have some way of knowing whether or not it's pure or impure.
He does. If he was told it was impure, then it's impure.
And if he wasn't told it was impure, then he just assumed it's pure?
Why would you assume otherwise?
Because it came from something that was impure.
But that's a logical leap, right? What's the default status of any item in creation? Pure.
All right.
Right? You snap a branch off a tree, it is tahor, it is pure, right? Until rabbinic law begins to say, actually, all the lands are impure. But under classical idea of how creation works, anything that exists in creation, that's default position is to be tahor, is to be pure. Why would you assume something was ritually impure unless you had proof that it was ritually impure? Right? It's the same way that, I don't assume anyone is a murderer unless I have proof that they're a murderer. I don't assume that you owe me money, and well, actually, I want to. I don't assume you owe him money unless you show me a document that says that he owes you money. Right? Even if it's logical, we were partners and we were working together, and I put all the money in. Of course, he was going to owe me money for it. If I don't see it on the piece of paper, I can't fine him and force him to give him money. That there has to be witnesses, there has to be evidence, there has to be something that is more than just logic to make a decision or a ruling in any case. And that's something that in casual life we don't usually rely on, or we don't demand. But Judaism took its legal decisions very, very seriously. It wasn't just pure, impure, whatever. It was, this is what God has asked us to rule. And we worked really hard to try and figure that out and not to overextend what we thought God wanted us to rule, but to rule as, I guess you might call it a strict constructionist in American terminology as possible. Does that make sense? I mean, does it make sense internally? I'm not saying whether you agree with his position, because obviously Rabbi Eliezer is arguing against other people here who think that no, you can use Kal v'chomer to make the case between these two.
So who won then?
If I remember correctly, not because this was not one of the ones that I put into my relevant cap as being needed, I believe that Rabbi Eliezer lost on this particular case. That we do not that we do say that the limb is ritually impure, but you can't quote me on that. So don't go around, looking for limbs. But thankfully, we get an additional answer for this, which is to try and rebut on Rabbi Eliezer's behalf from a logical point of view, rather than just, I don't have that tradition. So if you read part 5, we'll see a different way of looking at this.
Part 5. The impurity of living men is greater than the impurity of corpses.
What? Right? It's like, wait a minute. We've always been taught that dead people, they are the biggest form of impurity. And now you're telling me that the impurity of a regular person, right? So, let's imagine that he's become ritually impure for a whole variety of reasons. That is somehow greater than this? No, it can't be. This is secondary to this, right? It goes downhill, and the amount of impurity degrades. What are you talking about here? Well, here's how the logic works.
Because a living man causes that on which he lies and sits to become capable of making impure a man and clothing, and he also causes what is over him to transfer impurity to foods and liquids, which is defilement that a corpse does not cause.
Okay, so there are ways, according to the Torah, that, for example, a zav, that's a man with a discharge, that is of an irregular type, he can contaminate, he can spread the ritual impurity in ways that bodies don't. So that kind of means his ritual impurity is stronger, is greater than the ritual impurity of the body. Or at the very least, and this is why I think it's such a great wrap-up that they come with on behalf of Rabbi Eliezer, or at the very least, you can't just always assume kal v'chomer, because, living person, dead person, living person, dead person. There are ways that a living person is not always kal, is not always minor compared to the dead person. And that means that the logic is not airtight. And if the logic is not airtight, then can you really rely on that for your final decision? And that is I think a good point for us to always remember, is just because it seems reasonable to me doesn't mean that's the only reasonable conclusion. Sometimes there are other considerations that, actually, now I'm going to hesitate a little bit before I just say, well, it's obvious. And that hesitation is what Jewish law wants us to do. Right? We're supposed to hesitate and to study and to reflect and to debate and be open to counter opinions that even seem unreasonable, in order that we try to get as close as possible to what we hope is what God would like us to do.
Did the Talmud ever accept number 5 as being?
You'll have to go read the Talmud for that. I can't give you the whole discussion here. So, I mean, again, we're running through Mishnah because, believe it or not, this is quick compared to the Talmud. If we want to do a Talmud course, we can always switch over. But then that creates a whole nother level of in-depth study on a topic, which is what would be needed to do that. So that's fine, and the class wants to move that way. But otherwise, we're just going to be like a little skipping stone. And I know this went through 2 Mishnayot, and we're going to call it here because I want to do Mishnah 6.3 all as one. And as you can see, it is 2 pages long. So there's no way. Now, if your appetite for impurity from bodies is not slaked yet, just wait. Tomorrow we're going to be cutting up pieces and bones and all sorts of other bits to see. Sorry, next week we're going to be cutting up pieces and bones to see what the ritual impurity is of minute quantities. Because you all were ready to agree that a limb from a dead body was impure. What about a toenail?
Nope.
What about a tiny little scrap of bone?
Maybe you're 1/160th.
Well, we're gonna get to all sorts of measures of how much is enough for something to be ritually impure, and we're going to see some very interesting flows in the arguments between different rabbis that will show us that we should never just jump to conclusions. So, with that in mind, we will adjourn for tonight because I don't want to step into that until we're ready to finish it.
Yeah. Oh.
And if